Now, the concept of homeland conjures up a sense of identity, bound with nation, locality, state, or land, a sense of identity rooted in collective culture. But we all know home is not permanent. We leave home in order to create new homes. We move out to embark on another journey, whether it's leaving your family, your hometown, or your country. And the last century and the 21st century, it's characterized by global movement. The invention of the automobile, aviation, and sea liners has shrunk the world, and London has the world on its doorstep. Immigration, emigration, political refugees, economic migrants, tourists, travellers, explorers, colonisers, empire builders have shaped and changed nations, rewritten borders, and the world is continuously being reshaped. Then there are voluntary exiles, and many artists and writers from all over the world have moved from a homeland in pursuit of something better. However, increasingly nation borders are closing, becoming less welcoming, building fortresses around them to keep the foreigner out. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are increasingly feeling like a pipe dream. However, migration and movement of people marks the birth of human progress. Homer's The Odyssey centres on the hero Ulysses and his 10-year journey after the fall of Troy back to his homeland, Ithaca. In the Bible, we repeatedly see stories of the Jewish exile, the exodus from Egypt in the search for the Promised Land. And for many immigrants, the USA, America, was the Promised Land. The 28th President of the USA said that America lives in the heart of every man, everywhere, who wishes to find a region where he will be free to work out his destiny as he chooses. So what is Homeland for the three artists whose video shorts we're about to watch? A great literary hero of mine, V.S. Naipaul, dismissed his Trinidadian homeland as unimportant, uncreative, cynical, a dot on the map. But is it possible to be completely rootless? In his book, another author who I admire, the philosopher, Jason King, who originally came from Kingston, Jamaica, and emigrated to the USA, argues that morality sometimes demands that we give up old selves and commit ourselves to the goal of fashioning new moral identities. This is often accomplished by inviting the other in, letting go of the seriousness of one's identity, and allowing oneself to be remade by taking the other into oneself. So I'll leave you with those reflections. Those are my personal reflections on the programme. And the first film we're going to present is called Silent Sight by Zineb Sedira. Now, Zineb Sedira was born in 1963 in France, of Algerian parentage. She came to London to study art at Central St Martin's in 1992, completed her Masters at Slade and was a research fellow at the RCA from 1998 to 2003. She's had several solo exhibitions at the Photographers Gallery, the Palais de Tokyo, the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Marseille, to name a few. And Zineb is the founder of ARIA, which is a residency program in Algiers to support the development of the contemporary art scene in Algeria through international cross-cultural exchanges and collaboration. She received an arts admin bursary way back in 1999. And the work we're about to show was her first ever video work. Arts Admin has subsequently produced 3 of her films, video installations, which have been exhibited at Tate Britain, the Brixton Triennale and the New Art Exchange, as well as the sadly defunct Wapping Project. She's represented by the Galerie Kamel Menor in Paris, and we're very excited, this is great news, that she's been shortlisted for the Prix Marcel Duchamp this year, which is France's equivalent to the Turner Prize. And we wish her all the best and hope she wins when it's announced on the 24th of October. The second film is by Maria Kierka. Maria is a curator and academic who works with installation and performance. Born and raised in the north of Iran, Kierka came to the UK in 1979 where she pursued her art education, specialising in sculpture and obtaining her MA at the University of Central England in 1987. She returned to Iran in 1988, teaching at 2 major universities in Tehran. Since her return to the UK in the early 90s, she's exhibited extensively, both here as well as internationally. She's currently an assistant professor at Richmond University, and sadly she can't be with us because she's in Venice with her students for the Biennale. Among her exhibitions and presentations are conversation pieces, 1001 Questions, which was shown at Tate Britain in 2009, The Psychology of Fear, she also exhibited at the 198 Gallery. Other works and group shows she's been in is The Anatomy of Ignorance, Current Thinking, again at Tate Modern. And Maria, as well as Zineb, both live and work in London. Maria received an Arts Admin bursary in 2002. We'll have a break after those two pieces and do buy some drinks and imbibe yourself and relax. And then we'll be showing Shiraz's film Il de France, and I'll give an introduction to Shiraz after that. Thank you very much. Now, Shiraz and I are not going to talk all night, so we're going to certainly open the rest of the last 40 minutes to the audience. I'm sure you have a lot of observations and questions. Really just looking back at the three films, and I think what I especially like about all three pieces is how something intensely personal, as in Zineb's film Silent Sights, where it's just the artist kind of emerging and looking back to when she was a young girl, travelling to Algeria for the first time with her mother, and just the kind of cropping of the eyes, hinting at the idea of the veil, and what's called the haik, I think it's pronounced, in Algeria and places like Morocco, where it is a white garment which is worn, and also the kind of how that ties in with the Algerian Revolution from 1954 to 1962. Which was a major defeat for French colonialism, and a very violent one. And also just how that film embodies that relationship to her mother's homeland and Zineb Sedira as a young girl. So you kind of got three kind of presents in that kind of piece. And then Maria's piece, which is a beautiful poetic metaphor of, what do you take back from a country like Iran after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and the souvenir that she takes back is something, which is just around us, but yet it's she actually brought those bags back to the UK, and that breathing in and out of the bag becoming something quite a beautiful symbol, and quite a melancholic symbol. And then Shiraz's piece, which captures a vastness, a sort of epicness of history of Mauritius, which didn't have a revolution, didn't have that kind of political upheaval. So within that context, it'd be great to hear, why you kind of wanted to make this film about Mauritius.
Yes, why Mauritius? Mauritius, those of you who don't know, it's a tiny little island just east of Madagascar, and it encapsulates so many movements of people, so many migrations that have taken place in lots of corners of the world, in lots of post-colonies, and it has this mixture of Indians, Muslim traders. It has the slave history and the process of creolization, and because it is such a small place and such a short history, only 300 years old, it becomes a really interesting and open space in which to explore how these identities have homogenized and changed and settled into a modern democracy out of what at times were very polemic histories. Despite not having a revolution, it still has a particularly painful colonial history at times.
And that your use of so much history, both in terms of the buildings, the space, the architecture, and the lushness of almost a sense of prehistory through the kind of lush green presence that you shot so beautifully. How did you kind of you almost feel like you're kind of traveling, you know, your eye is the camera, and in a sense there's a kind of almost fast pacing that's kind of going through with history and how you frame the pieces. Tell us more about the kind of visual language, and then we'd like to hear more about the sounds, because it's such a rich, layered sound that you've created.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a painter, and that is my formal background, and so in that sense, the film unfolds itself as a painting. I felt I needed to make the film. I needed to introduce these spaces to audience, and to introduce some of the identities and some of the protagonists of this history. But it's also a history, I think, that resonates in lots of places, lots of different corners, as I said before. And so the framing, I mean, in my painting work, I try to create a larger picture that connects histories and places and groups of people together, but at the same time I sort of also search for something that's also deeply personal and psychological. This is, you know, not just in terms of myself as the author, but also in terms of how the audience can perhaps connect to some of these spaces. And so in terms of the natural spaces that you move through in the film, I sought out spaces that hadn't changed a huge amount in Mauritius's 300 years, and so that you could be face to face with surfaces and light, and that haven't changed a huge amount, and therefore you could perhaps connect directly with those environments that those predecessors had encountered themselves. In terms of the architectural spaces, there are lots of historical connections as to each of those spaces, very specifically researched, but also the film isn't a historical reenactment in any way. You know, these spaces are as they are today. So in that sense, I was trying to bring you back to the present. You know, despite kind of wandering through this history, it's still very much about being in the present and looking at these spaces as they are in the post-colony, as they are today.
And I mean, Mauritius now is some people would describe it as a tourist theme park. You know, it's dedicated to sort of boundless leisure for those who can afford it. It is a luxury holiday, and quite a beautiful country. Your focus on the past almost has a commentary on the present and maybe the future. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I wanted to capture key moments or key processes in how some of these different groups that they were exploring, from the Creoles to the Muslims to the Hindus, how they have homogenized in post-colonial, in the new democracy that they are. Although I don't really like to use that term post-colonial too much, but how those groups have homogenized and how they have settled to where they are in society. And the moment where you hear Gandhi's voice talking about the coming together of Hindu nationalism. Gandhi came to Mauritius and he delivered a speech to a very small group of people, and 40 years later they have become the political class. Mauritius is a very layered society along racial and religious lines, and those layers, very sedimentary layers, are very easy to read, even in the language today. And so perhaps in other spaces, for example, East London, where maybe 50 years ago you could have read some of those distinctive layers, they have perhaps become more blurred, and that language itself has perhaps disappeared. In a place like Mauritius, it's still very, very visible.
And talking about the sounds, there's a lot of archival research or source material that you found. I'm quite intrigued by the very kind of almost very European house interior, and the text that you use in that, which you give quite a lot of space to. Why did you do that?
Well, for example, the interior where you hear the sound of the independence ceremony, and then you see the independence ceremony on television. These were Muslim trader houses that were a kind of a burgeoning middle class, and in fact that house really hasn't changed in 40 years, that interior. And it was about the language of the objects, that this yearning for this middle class to get out from under empire, to sort of be master of your own destiny, author of your own identity, and yet at the same time the way the French lace, the French furniture, and then the very little incidental Islamic or Asian objects that are placed around. It shows a landscape that is still very much, you are still very much authored from within the British Empire. Despite this need to be out of it, how do you author yourself out of something that you were born within? So there's aspects of that. There's also Mauritius. It was a French colony, and then became a British colony, and so the Francophile influence on the language and on the identity of people across the board is huge. And so when you're talking about the Creoles, the ex-slave communities, there is very little that you can research, because there was very little that was ever written about those folks, because they did not have a status within society. And so, in a way, to unravel aspects of their identity, you have to look at the old colonial families, which are still very present and still very much own lots of the plantations and farms and things around the island. And so, those identities are very closely bound together, very closely tied together, and the space as the colonial house. You have to kind of see, you have to, in order to explore a group of people who had nothing, you almost have to look at the opposite space in which their presence occupied. And actually the voice, the very long reading in French that you hear through that plantation scene is actually from a diary of an author called Bernardin Saint-Pierre, who was a French Enlightenist, and he wrote a book called Paul and Virginie, which was a huge success in the 19th century and put Mauritius on the map back in those days. And in that book he describes the colonial masters living at one with their slaves, living in the bosom of nature, which is some of the prints that you see on the wall as you move into that house. Whereas Bernardin's actual experience of Ile-de-France, as it was called, Ile-de-France was the name of Mauritius under the French, was actually the complete opposite. And the passage that he reads is how he's walking along the road one day and he meets a group of maroon hunters who are slave hunters, ex-slaves who have been trained to hunt out escaped slaves. And he talks about a very graphic and horrible scene in which this young woman is carrying the head of her lover, which they have just caught and killed. And he describes how the island of paradise disappears and this island of abomination descends before him. And that was actually read by the owner of that plantation house, who's still an aristocrat and still a member of this family.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, Paul and Virginie is it is one of those romantic 19th century novels, almost a love story of castaways, two young castaways. Yeah. Shipwrecked on the island, but I've never read it actually, because I can't read French that well, but it is almost a sort of projection of European innocence in a sense, and this in a kind of country which is entirely the opposite of that, through colonialism and slavery.
Yes, exactly. Those dualities, those twisted dualities. When you're moving through the cave, where you see the Catholic effigies, Catholicism again is now the one homogenizing factor for that community and for the Creole community. And so through there you hear the whispering from a passage from the Bible the story of Ham. And this particular story is what was used to justify or to give theological reasoning to the system of slavery under French Catholicism. And so the Code Noir, which some of you who might study this area might have heard of, is based upon, very, very shakily based upon this one passage in which the descendants of one tribe are cursed and cursed to be the slaves of their brothers. And so it is, again, you know, Catholicism is the one major factor, one major force in the lives of these people. And so, again, it's these twisted dualities.
And I mean, it's my last kind of observation question, and we'll open it out. But the kind of the idea of this creolized nation, which different races, and there's an interesting moment in that piece of archive about independence where, you know, the troubles between the Creoles and Muslims kind of didn't disturb the celebration. I mean, did you kind of explore that any further?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's complex. You know, those negotiations for independence, you know, either they go down the route of revolution or they go down this route of negotiation where you give up trade deals for the next 100 years and you buy your way out of empire. And at that time, there were several groups, including the Creoles, who didn't want to leave the British Empire because they thought that the Indians would take over. And so, yeah, so groups were being hedged against each other during that period.
Fascinating. Well, it is a really beautiful film, very rich, and it's gorgeously shot, so well done. Let's open it out now, I think, to the audience. Any questions or observations?
I'm probably loud now. Just picking up on your last point, that is interesting. I think that duality of wanting to leave the colony and wanting to stay, and I think it was really prevalent within the film in terms of there was a lot of there was no fighting, so to speak, for images, but there was a really, you know, the contrast between the nature and then the structures, and they obviously work together, the roots of the trees and the wood of the houses and things like that. But it's not really a question, but that was really clear, and I think as you were filming, I know you think about that often, but were you seeing those images throughout Mauritius, and as you were filming, noticing the duality of the sort of social as well as the visual and the political?
Yes, I mean, what you find today is that all the groups of people that were willing to talk to me or willing to open up their communities to me, although coming from Mauritius, it is such a segregated society in lots of ways that it is very difficult to enter other communities openly. And actually, so those groups that did open up, they are trying to author the new national narrative, and they are trying to make sure that their chapter, that they are present, that their version of or their perspective on who they are is definitely there in the book, so to speak, in the national authoring. So even today, 50 years later, as we know, even here, there is that constant lobbying, moving, jostling position.
Any reasons why you didn't film many people?
It's a good question. I felt like it would be too specific to bring individuals into it, and actually I felt that those spaces needed to be plural. There needed to be the possibilities of these being your spaces as well. Although at first perhaps they seem quite strange and alien, as you look, hopefully as you look closer and you see the objects and you see those crossovers, you perhaps see those crossovers that take place in different spaces, different countries, different environments.
I was going to ask the same question about people, but what was really interesting to me, what you were just saying then, was about the kind of the stratified layer of society, or the very kind of deep divisions between people, whether that's kind of on a religious basis or on some kind of historical thing. And understood you. Are you saying that's beginning to transform, or is that still very...
It's still very much in force.
Yeah.
It is transforming, but it's still very much in force. And again, which is why it's such a great space to explore these themes, because they're still very visible.
And how do you feel about that? I mean, I know you were saying that it's kind of difficult to actually get access to communities that don't recognise you as one of their own or something, but how does that affect?
It's one of those, I think it's one of, I expect there's lots of artists in this room, it's one of those complexities of how you work with a group of people and how you explore, and ultimately at times there is a distancing, which, because you can't get past a certain...
No, I'm interested in it because I'm a documentary filmmaker, so I've got a different, I've got that perspective of like, I'm just going to tell you about who you are and what you're doing, and get access in that way. So how do people respond to you as an artist?
They were comfortable because they didn't see me as part of their landscape.
Right, okay.
There was nothing that could be gained from me in that sense. So you are a visitor. In all aspects. I mean, recently we're hopefully we're going to screen a film on Mauritian national TV, and one of the emails from one of the producers was he's far enough away for it not to be politically too sensitive as to who's authoring it.
Yeah.
So there's positives of that, but I think there are also complexities there.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
I'd really like to hear how that goes. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I think it's a beautiful film. Very provocative and quite a journey. Very big things.
Any other questions? Observations? And not just about this film, but the other two?
I mean, maybe it's just to follow up from that, because I have, quite throughout the film, I kind of had this changing from having the feeling that the artist was an onlooker to really, and that changed quite a lot, and it kind of shifted throughout the film, which I thought, and I couldn't even pin it down why. It wasn't even the obvious shots of okay, now you go back and you see more trees or something. And so I was wondering, because I think we spent a lot of time there, what kind of process did you have to do? Shot a lot and then edited, or did you have a lot of maybe even material of people that you took out, or what was the...
I shot a lot of material. I shot more than is in the edit. I didn't storyboard the entire film in one go. I storyboarded sections of it, and again, it's partly because of my approach as a painter and not for me as a filmmaker that I felt like I needed to balance the film throughout, as I do when you balance a painting out. And so there was always an overview of that, but there were obviously incidences where you get very drawn into sections. And there are parts of the film where I did want you to feel as if perhaps you were moving through this, that your eyes were being taken across. And there are other moments, perhaps like when you hear the footsteps through the forest, that perhaps who are these protagonists? Are these early colonialists? Are these escaped slaves? Are these maroons? There is that as well. Yeah.
Hi, I've got two questions. How much time do you spend in Mauritius, and for how long? And during the filming last year, did things come up that surprised you about your relationship?
Well, I'm from Mauritius, and I left there when I was quite young. I spent most of my school holidays there as a child until I was in my late teens. So I've always had a very strong connection to the place, and I always felt like I kind of grew up there as in equal to the UK. But I haven't spent a period of time like that as an adult, and so it was a very privilege to be there that long, and I have most of my family still live there. But it allowed me, that time allowed me to get out of that community and into others. And that's something that I didn't think that I would ever, until this project began, this wasn't something that I thought I would do in my lifetime. I mean, I'm sure some of you here are from different spaces. There is that wanting to be able to spend, a very indulgent amount of time sort of just exploring and listening to people. And so, yeah, there were some very profound moments in terms of who I was and my relationship to the place, yeah.
I really liked how the whole film, when you were talking about going through a journey, really felt like a journey to me, because most of your shots were actually, though, you know, sometimes close-ups or inserts or everything, they were always moving, and I felt like I was moving through the space with you.
Yeah.
Because you're a painter and you're talking about balancing the piece, I'm curious about the moments in which you selected to use still images, like the lock, or the graves, or which really stood out to me because there were few moments where we weren't moving. And I was just wondering if this was something that you did consciously, and how you chose to balance the piece through these static images.
It was conscious, and I guess some of those aesthetics chose themselves because they opened themselves up to being still moments. Moments, I mean, I don't know, those of you who work in film, you will know that if you're trying to pull movie stills out, it's actually very difficult to get a really nice frame shot because they are always moving and you don't get to see the thing that you're moving to in a single frame. So those objects that you stayed upon in close-up, they naturally lend themselves to those compositions. But yeah, they were conscious.
Yes, do.
I really liked all three of those films together. I thought there was kind of, you know, a journey from the minutiae, although it was a big subject, through to yours. How did it feel? Was that
I did. I enjoyed that. I mean, this Zeneb's piece is very deeply personal and quite deeply psychological, I think. And I felt that resonated at moments within my own work. And then it kind of breaks open into Maria's very performative piece. Yeah, it was nice. It was kind of it opens up and then. So there you go. Well done, Manick.
Well done, Manick.
Great, thank you. We should do more of these film nights. So, I mean, we'll wrap up if there are any other questions. But I suppose I just want to kind of go back to how Mauritius is viewed and compared to Algeria, compared to Iran, the wealth of art and literature and films that come from those two large countries and the kind of tumultuous history it's had. Mauritius generally is not really well known for its, it's used in Bollywood movies for those very romantic mountain shots of dancing, protagonists with all that sort of flirty suggestions. And recently there's been some novels that have been looking back at Mauritius, and particularly the sort of unearthing some incredible stories, particularly around the Jewish presence, for example. And the last novel I read, which is about an exiled Sri Lankan prince. So it seems like there's something brewing there, which is quite exciting. But what is the cultural arts scene? V.S. Naipaul, for example, in his controversial essay, which he wrote in 1972 about Mauritius, and he called it the overcrowded barracoon, said that Mauritius was characteristic of half-made societies. Probably very dismissive about the island in 1972. It felt like it didn't have its own. It just borrowed from the Black Power movement. It borrowed from other parts of the world, and it didn't have anything to call its own. What do you think of that? That sort of that cultural lack of cultural presence that Mauritius doesn't seem to have.
Well, it's a funny thing because on one hand it is a really successful democracy. It has its own version of the NHS, which is amazing for a country of its size. I mean, it only has a population of 1 million people, and it's only about the size of London. So I think there are restraints in that sense as to what fuels its cultural development. But as a country, as a nation, as a democracy, it's a really successful one, and one that is very unmarred in compared to others, especially in the last 20 years of political change. But I think it's funny. It's a country of migrants. I think that it is, which is why I went back to make this piece. That it's still wrestling with these big monsters of who they are, and and how that does link directly back to colonialism and slavery. I mean, not that you necessarily want to draw those lines so distinctively, but it's not necessarily spoken of, but it's in the language. The language is inherently racist. Most Mauritians do not want to be associated with being Creole or being a descendant of a slave, and yet most are. And the language itself is the language that has developed directly out of that whole history. Their own national language is a language that is not celebrated, which is quite a rare thing, I think, for a nation. Even its national music, which is held in huge regard and is sung in that language, is still somehow compartmentalized and kept apart. And I think that probably has a clue as to where and why perhaps it is in some ways a cultural desert. But it's a country of migrants, and I know many Mauritians of dual identity here who are artists. There are lots, and some of them quite famous artists. So in that sense, there is a pouring out of creativity. It's just, I guess, it depends on how much weight you place on the authoring of it directly from.
Any last questions before we go? Okay, well, Shiraz, I just want to thank you for bringing the film to Toynbee Studios, and it was a real pleasure to host the film.